He was born with no arms, no legs, and almost no hope. But what he did next changed millions of lives. Before we begin, if you believe that life's challenges can be turned into purpose and that no matter where you start, your story can still inspire others, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. On this channel, we bring you true stories of courage, resilience, and hope that can change the way you see the world. Now, let's dive into the extraordinary journey of Nick Vujicic. They had prepared for everything, bought the baby clothes, painted the nursery a calming shade of yellow, and chosen the name Nicholas long before the due date. Boris and Dushka Vujicic were like any expectant couple, filled with nervous excitement and 1,000 dreams for their first child. On that early morning in December 1982, the hospital in Melbourne hummed with its usual rhythm. Nurses moved swiftly, doctors spoke in calm voices, and fluorescent lights flickered faintly above. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. The moment Nicholas was born, the air shifted. It wasn't just that his cry was quieter than expected. It was the way the delivery room fell into a sudden, unnatural silence. No congratulations, no cheers. No one handed him to his mother with a smile. Instead, a quiet gasp from a nurse broke the stillness. Another nurse turned away, her hand covering her mouth. The doctor held the baby carefully, his face pale as he examined what he could not believe. Boris took a hesitant step forward, eyes darting between the doctor and his son. Then he saw it. There were no arms, no legs, just a tiny body, impossibly still, swaddled in confusion and disbelief. Dushka, still recovering from labor, reached out instinctively. "Let me see my baby," she whispered, but no one moved. The silence in the room grew heavier with every passing second. A doctor finally approached, his voice clinical and distant as he explained, "Your son was born with a rare condition. He has no limbs. It's called tetramelia syndrome." Dushka blinked. The words didn't make sense. It was as if the doctor were speaking a different language. Boris stared at the child, trying to process the unimaginable. He had imagined tossing a football in the yard, teaching his son to ride a bike, walking him to school. And now, all of that seemed to dissolve before him. He turned away and walked to the corner of the room, overwhelmed. Dushka, still holding out her arms, was finally given the child. As she looked down at Nicholas, her eyes welled with tears not of rejection, but of aching love and fear. This was her child, her perfect child. And yet, the world would not see him that way. The days that followed were a blur of hushed conversations and heavy hearts. Family members visited and, one by one, left with forced smiles and polite condolences. The doctors spoke in terms of special needs and lifelong care. One even suggested institutionalizing him. "You don't have to take him home," they offered. "There are places for children like this." Boris recoiled at the suggestion. Dushka, weak but resolute, said only, "He is ours." But behind closed doors, they struggled. In the quiet of the night, Dushka cried silently, wondering if she had done something wrong during pregnancy. Was it her fault? Had she eaten something? Missed a vitamin? Boris, meanwhile, avoided mirrors. He didn't want to see the sadness etched on his own face. Their home, once filled with laughter and light, became a place of whispered worries. They didn't just fear for their son's future, they feared for how the world would treat him. And then came the questions. Not from others, but from themselves. How do you raise a child with no arms to hold you and no legs to run into your embrace? Would he ever feed himself, dress himself, write, work, love? They didn't have the answers. All they had was each other and a promise whispered between them in the darkness. "We will love him, no matter what." As the weeks turned into months, that promise became their anchor. They began to study, to ask, to learn. Dushka found ways to cradle Nicholas that gave him support. Boris figured out how to build modified toys that Nicholas could manipulate with the small, paddle-like foot extending from his left hip. Every smile from Nicholas became a small miracle. Every sound he made, a celebration. They chose to see not what was missing, but what was present. His bright eyes, his gentle spirit, his will to engage with the world even as a baby. Still, it wasn't easy. Strangers stared. Some turned away in discomfort. Others asked cruel questions. What happened to him? Was it genetic? Do you wish you'd known earlier? Dushka never had the heart to answer. Boris, at times, clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. But Nicholas grew. And with every passing day, he taught them more about love, patience, and strength than they had ever known. By the time he was old enough to sit upright, Nicholas had developed a way to use his foot-like limb to hold objects, flip pages, and even feed himself with some assistance. He laughed often, loud and clear, as if completely unaware of the limitations others saw in him. Boris began to see glimpses of the son he had once imagined, not the one who would play soccer, but the one who would change the world in a way neither parent could yet understand. They no longer mourned what Nicholas didn't have. They celebrated what he did, a fierce mind, a loving heart, and a soul untouched by self-pity. Where others might see tragedy, they had begun to see purpose. It wasn't the life they had expected, but maybe, just maybe, it was the life they were meant to live. And somewhere, deep inside the little boy with no arms and no legs, a quiet fire had already begun to burn. A fire that would one day light stadiums, silence bullies, and inspire millions. But for now, it simply warmed the hearts of two people who once feared his birth was a curse, only to discover it was a blessing in disguise. The world outside didn't stop to make space for Nick. As soon as he was old enough to understand the difference between himself and other children, that difference began to loom like a shadow. At school, he was the boy in the wheelchair, the one without hands to raise or feet to run with. He didn't need mirrors to know he was different. He saw it in every child's eyes. In the quick glances, in the stares, in the laughter that tried to hide behind cupped hands, but always found its way to his ears. At first, he didn't even know what he was being laughed at. He only knew that it hurt. Nick tried to blend in, to be invisible, but it was impossible to hide in a world built for bodies that looked nothing like his. At recess, he watched from the sidelines as other boys kicked soccer balls, climbed monkey bars, and chased each other until they were red-faced with joy. Nick's version of play was different. It was quieter. He would use his small foot-like appendage to flip through books, to draw crude circles with a pen wedged between his shoulder and chin. But none of that drew friends. It only drew more distance. His teachers tried to be kind, but they didn't know what to do with him. Some were patronizing, others too afraid to treat him like a regular student. At home, his parents did everything they could to instill confidence. His mother, Dushka, taught him to type using his toes. His father built a special device to help him turn the pages of a book. They celebrated his smallest victories like they were Olympic medals. But none of that seemed to quiet the growing storm inside Nick. He began to ask questions that children shouldn't have to ask. Why me? What did I do wrong? Why did God make me this way? Every night, those questions echoed through his mind, unanswered and unrelenting. The more he thought, the heavier they became, like stones added one by one to a sack he couldn't put down. He smiled less. He spoke less. And inside, the darkness crept in. By the time he turned 8, Nick was already battling thoughts far older than his years. He had become an expert at hiding his pain. At school, he joked with teachers, gave polite answers, and acted as if everything was fine. But behind closed doors, he felt like a mistake, an error in a world that celebrated perfection. One afternoon, after a particularly cruel day at school, he came home and locked himself in the bathroom. He filled the tub with water and stared at it, imagining what it would be like to slip beneath and never resurface. He didn't have the limbs to end his life the way others might, but he believed he could tilt forward, face down, and drown. He'd thought about it for days. Calculated the angle. Figured out how long it might take. He'd even practiced balancing on the edge of the tub. And yet, when the moment came, something stopped him. A single image flickered in his mind, his parents. Their tears. The way his mother kissed his forehead even on days when he couldn't look her in the eyes. He imagined his dad, the man who never cried, collapsing to the floor. That image pulled him back. Nick broke down sobbing. He wasn't crying for himself anymore. He was crying for them. For the love they'd given. For the sacrifices they'd made. And for the shame he felt in even thinking of throwing it all away. That moment, soaked in tears instead of water, became a quiet pivot. It didn't erase the pain, but it awakened something new, a question he had never asked before. What if there's more? From that day on, the darkness didn't vanish, but it began to retreat. He didn't speak of that day to anyone, not yet. But he started reading more, watching documentaries, listening to motivational tapes. He discovered stories of others who had faced tragedy and turned it into purpose. Slowly, he began to wonder, if they could do it, could he? At school, Nick began to lean into his strengths. He was sharp, smarter than most of his classmates. He made jokes that made people laugh with him, not at him. He found creative ways to do things no one thought he could. Riding with his foot, picking up objects with his chin, opening doors with his shoulder. Bit by bit, The world became less foreign, more possible. But the questions never fully left. At night, they still crept into his thoughts. Not the questions of, why me? Those were beginning to fade. Now the questions were more daring. What if I could help someone else like me? What if this pain has a purpose? What if I'm not a mistake at all? One afternoon, his school held an assembly. The principal had invited a guest speaker to talk to the students. Someone who had survived a serious car crash and now spoke about overcoming adversity. Nick sat in the front row, leaning forward, soaking in every word. The speaker was missing a leg, but he stood tall. He cracked jokes. He told stories of pain and triumph and faith. And when he finished, the room erupted in applause. Nick clapped with his shoulder, grinning so wide his cheeks hurt. For the first time, he saw a reflection of what he might become, not the same body, but the same spirit. He turned to the teacher beside him and whispered, "I want to do that one day." The teacher smiled politely, probably thinking it was a passing thought. But Nick meant it. That night, he opened his journal and wrote just one sentence at the top of a fresh page. Maybe I was made this way for a reason. That sentence would become his compass. By the time Nick turned 19, something in him had hardened, not in a bitter way, but in the way steel is forged under fire. Years of facing whispers, dodging stares, and waking each day in a body that defied expectations had sculpted not just a resilient heart, but a purpose beginning to take shape. He had graduated high school with honors, earned a degree in accounting and financial planning, and had done it all without hands to write or feet to walk. Still, despite these victories, a voice inside him kept asking, what now? He hadn't found the answer in textbooks, nor in applause. He found it in a hallway, almost by accident. A school janitor had noticed something others hadn't, how the younger kids at school gravitated toward Nick, not just with curiosity, but with admiration. "You have something to say," the janitor told him one day, leaning on his mop with quiet conviction. "And people need to hear it." At first, Nick dismissed the comment. Him? Speak in front of people? His stomach turned just thinking about it. But the words lingered. One day, when a local youth group needed a last-minute speaker, someone, maybe even that janitor, gave them Nick's name. The invitation was simple. Come share a bit of your story. Just a few words. Nick hesitated, his heart pounding. He could talk to friends, sure. But a room full of teenagers? What if they laughed? What if he froze? Still, he said yes. The night of the event, he sat nervously behind a curtain, listening to the chatter of the crowd. It wasn't a stadium, just a small church hall. Maybe 50 people. But it felt like 1,000. He had no script, just a few notes scribbled down by his shoulder using his foot and a stylus. When his name was called, the room fell quiet. He moved forward, his wheelchair clicking softly over the wooden floor. Every eye followed him. The silence pressed in, thick and expectant. He looked up. Their faces stared back, not with pity, not yet, but with hesitation. And then, Nick spoke. The first words trembled out of him. His voice cracked. His nerves flared. But then he told a joke, one he'd practiced. Something light about dating and having no hands to hold. The room chuckled, then laughed. The tension snapped like a twig. And just like that, the fear melted. He began to tell them about his life. The bullying. The bathtub. The thoughts he had once tried to drown. And how somehow he had come back up for air. He spoke not as a victim but as a survivor. Not as someone to be pitied, but as someone who could offer something of value. As the words flowed, he stopped seeing their faces and started seeing their hearts. One girl in the third row began to cry, silent tears tracing her cheeks. Another boy nodded, hands clenched in his lap. These weren't strangers anymore. They were fellow travelers. And in that moment, Nick wasn't just telling a story. He was building a bridge. When he finished, there was a pause, then a standing ovation. Not the polite kind, but the kind that rattles the room. Nick felt it all. Shock, joy, disbelief. But most of all, something he hadn't felt in a long time, certainty. He rolled off the stage and didn't even make it halfway across the room before a young man stopped him. "You changed something in me tonight," the teen whispered. "Thank you." That night, Nick couldn't sleep. Not because he was nervous, but because something had awakened. That voice in his head, once so cruel and doubtful, now whispered with a different tone. Maybe this is it. Maybe this is why. In the weeks that followed, the invitations came trickling in. A youth retreat, a local school, a community event. Each one brought new faces, new stories, new breakthroughs. Sometimes it was hard. He would feel tired, exposed. But he never backed down. He knew now that every time he spoke, Someone's life might shift just a little closer to light. He started studying speakers, Les Brown, Tony Robbins, even pastors who moved crowds with just their voice. But he didn't want to become a copy. He didn't want to inspire because of flash or fame. He wanted to connect, to serve, to help people who, just like he once had, felt like they didn't belong in their own skin. The more he spoke, the more refined his message became. He didn't just talk about physical limitations. He talked about emotional ones, mental ones, the prisons we build in our minds, brick by invisible brick. He became fluent in the language of pain, not because he studied it, but because he had lived it. And more importantly, he had risen from it. One day, after a speech at a high school, a counselor approached him. Her hand shook as she held a crumpled letter. "One of our students left this on my desk after hearing you," she said, eyes wide with emotion. It was a suicide note. He was going to do it this weekend. He changed his mind after your talk. Nick read the note, his vision blurring. He didn't feel proud. He felt humbled. The stakes were real now. This wasn't about feel-good moments or applause. This was about life and death and the fragile spaces in between. From that moment, Nick made a vow. He would go wherever he was needed. Schools, churches, prisons. Even if only one person showed up. Even if his voice trembled. Even if the message hurt to deliver. Because the world didn't need a perfect speaker. It needed a real one. Someone who could say, with authority, that brokenness is not the end of the road. It can be the beginning. Nick sat at the edge of a cluttered desk, the kind that creaked under too many papers and dreams. Around him, the air buzzed with quiet determination. His small team, mostly friends, a few volunteers, and one ever-hopeful intern, huddled in a borrowed office space, all of them looking at a whiteboard that held just 3 words in thick black marker: life without limbs. At first glance, the phrase sounded like a cruel joke. But Nick said it with conviction. This wasn't a lament. It was a declaration. He didn't want pity. He wanted purpose. He wanted this phrase to stand for something far bigger than his own life. The idea was simple but powerful: to create an organization that would reach people across the world who were struggling physically, emotionally, spiritually, and remind them that their lives still mattered, that their limitations didn't define them. They had no money, no corporate backing, no connections. What they did have was a vision. And Nick's fire. He wasn't just a motivational speaker anymore. He was a movement in motion. Every speech, every event, every letter he received fueled him. The emails poured in, people saying his words had stopped them from ending their lives. Teens who had started talking to their parents again. Men in prison who were beginning to believe they were more than their mistakes. Nick didn't sleep much in those days. He didn't want to. There were too many places to go, too many people to reach. He booked his own flights, packed his own bags, and had a team of friends help him get dressed each day so he could hit the road. Some days, he spoke in high schools so small they didn't have microphones. Other days, he stood before massive auditoriums filled with thousands. It didn't matter. Whether 5 people or 5,000, Nick gave them all the same energy because he knew, from painful experience, that even one life mattered. The road was hard, though. Physically, his body was pushed to the edge. Hours of travel, cold hotel rooms with no proper accessibility, missed meals, exhaustion. Emotionally, it drained him to keep opening the same wounds night after night, reliving the loneliness, the bathtub moment, the bullying. There were nights he collapsed onto a hotel bed and stared at the ceiling, too tired to cry, too wired to sleep. Sometimes he wondered if it was enough, if he was doing any good at all. But then, a letter would arrive. Or a child would walk up to him after an event, eyes wide with admiration, and say, "You make me feel like I can do anything." And just like that, the fuel returned. His speeches evolved. He started to mix humor into the heaviness. Self-deprecating jokes that disarmed his audience and invited them in. "I don't need a wallet," he'd grin. "I've got no pockets to lose it in." The laughter always came. And then, so did the silence, the deep kind, the kind that meant people were listening, not just hearing. In those silences, he laid down truth. About pain. About faith. About choosing hope over despair, again and again. People began to take notice. Media outlets requested interviews. Churches invited him across oceans. Schools that had once turned him down now begged for a spot on his calendar. But fame didn't touch him. He wasn't chasing lights, he was chasing light. He still answered emails himself when he could. Still sat in tiny kitchens with struggling families and prayed with them. still cried with strangers in airport terminals who stopped him just to say, "You helped me come back to life." And as his reach grew, so did the message. Life without limbs wasn't just about Nick anymore. It was about them. The kid with dyslexia who thought he was stupid. The young woman with scars on her wrist. The father who lost his job and felt worthless. Nick made them all feel seen. He reminded them that broken things still have value. Sometimes even more. One day, standing backstage at a megachurch in Texas, he looked out at the crowd through a small curtain slit. 10,000 people waited. Behind him, a volunteer whispered, "Does it ever get easier?" Nick smiled gently. "No," he replied. "But it always feels worth it." That night, his speech was electric. He spoke about turning obstacles into opportunities. About the lies we believe, that we're not enough, not capable, not worthy, and how those lies crumble when confronted with truth. His voice soared with conviction. And when he closed with, "I stand before you not because I have everything, but because I know what it means to have nothing," the room fell into a stunned silence before rising to their feet in thunderous applause. Afterward, people waited hours just to speak to him. Some brought their children. Some brought their wounds. Nick listened to them all. One boy with a prosthetic arm said, "I used to wish I could hide. Now I want to help." That was the moment Nick realized he wasn't just changing hearts, he was planting new ones. With every trip, every talk, every silent prayer whispered over a stranger, life without limbs grew. Not just in numbers, but in meaning. It became a haven for the overlooked, a voice for the voiceless, a spark in dark places. And Nick? He became more than a speaker. He became proof. Proof that you don't need arms to reach people. You don't need legs to walk with them through their pain. All you need is truth, and a voice brave enough to speak it. For years, Nick had stood on stages across continents, declaring with unwavering confidence that everyone was worthy of love. That brokenness did not mean unlovable. That even without arms to embrace and legs to walk, a man could still live a full, powerful life. But in the quiet moments, between the cheers and the travel, he often wondered, did he really believe that for himself? He had always dreamed of love, not admiration from audiences, but a real, honest connection. The kind that looked past the physical and saw the soul. The kind that didn't just smile at him after a speech, but stayed when the lights dimmed and the cameras were packed away. And though Nick believed in miracles, part of him feared that maybe this one, this deepest longing, was the miracle that might never come. Then came Kane. They met at an event in Texas. Nick was scheduled to speak, as usual, and Kane had come with a friend who insisted she listen to this incredible speaker who would blow her mind. She hadn't expected anything extraordinary, maybe another inspiring talk, maybe a few tears, but when Nick rolled onto that stage and began to speak, something inside her shifted. Not because he was without limbs, not even because of what he said, but because of how he said it. She saw something real, something tender beneath the confidence. A deep strength wrapped in humility, and a smile that made her forget about everything else in the room. Nick noticed her, too. Among thousands, he remembered her eyes, calm, kind, quietly curious. After the event, she approached him. Their conversation was short, light, just a few minutes. But it lingered. Days passed. Then weeks. They exchanged messages, then calls. At first, Nick tried to convince himself it was nothing, that she was just being nice. But every time she laughed at one of his jokes, or asked about his day, or waited patiently as he typed out a long message using his foot, that old fear began to loosen its grip. Still, Nick wrestled with doubts. Could she really see past the surface? Past the wheelchair? Past the awkward logistics of needing help with everyday things? Would she still see him the same way if she saw the full picture, the scars, the vulnerabilities, the raw truths behind his polished talks? One night, after a long call that left them both laughing until their sides hurt, Nick found himself staring at the ceiling, overwhelmed not with fear, but with possibility. Maybe, just maybe, someone had come along who didn't want perfect, who wanted real. Their courtship wasn't typical. There were no walks hand in hand, no quick weekend getaways. Everything had to be planned, adapted, made intentional. But it never felt like effort. It felt like building something sacred, slowly and honestly. Kane never treated him like he was broken. She didn't flinch when he needed help lifting a glass or maneuvering onto a couch. She didn't hesitate to take his call when he felt anxious. She saw him. Not the speaker, not the symbol, but the man. And Nick, for the first time, allowed himself to be vulnerable in ways he hadn't been before. He opened up about the darkest parts of his past, the bathtub moment, the years of self-loathing, the masks he sometimes still wore. He expected hesitation, but Cannae didn't pull back. She leaned in. "You don't scare me," she told him gently one night. "Your strength doesn't come from what you've overcome. It comes from how open you are about the journey." That was the moment Nick knew. The proposal was uniquely his, creative, tender, and a little clumsy in the best way. With the help of friends, Nick had the ring placed in a box that he could lift with his shoulder and neck. He practiced for days, getting the motion just right. When the moment came, he rolled up to Cannae in the middle of a small, intimate gathering and, voice trembling, said, "I may not have hands to hold you, but I promise to lift you in every way I can. Will you marry me?" She didn't even let him finish before falling to her knees and wrapping him in an embrace that said more than words ever could. Their wedding was everything they dreamed, simple, joyful, and sacred. As they stood before their loved ones, exchanging vows, there wasn't a single dry eye in the room. Nick's voice cracked as he looked at her and said, "You make me feel whole. Not because I was incomplete, but because you've shown me that love doesn't require limbs, it requires presence. It requires faith." The years that followed only deepened their bond. They traveled together, spoke at events, built a life framed by laughter, compromise, and faith. And then came children, tiny hands reaching for a father with no hands of his own. But Nick learned how to hold them with his heart, with his voice, with the strength of his spirit. He helped change diapers with his shoulder. He sang lullabies. He comforted tears. And though he couldn't physically carry them in his arms, they never doubted he carried them always in his soul. Nick often reflected on how the world had once told him love like this was impossible, that no woman would ever look past his body and into his heart. But they were wrong. Love did not require symmetry. It did not require perfection. It only required truth. And Nick and Cannae built theirs one truth at a time. Every time Nick stood on a stage and shared his journey, he now carried something new with him. A quiet certainty that echoed beneath his words. A living example, waiting at home, that proved what he had always believed deep down, but had finally come to know. Love isn't limited by limbs. It's measured by the courage to show up, fully and unapologetically, and say, "Here I am." No walls. No hiding. Just me. And in that space, miracles are born. The applause of thousands had become familiar. The spotlights, the introductions, the media appearances. All part of Nick's new rhythm. Yet, despite the success, despite the bright lights and big stages, Nick knew his mission wasn't meant to stop with the privileged few who could afford a conference ticket or attend a church event. There were people the world had locked away, places most wouldn't dare go, prisons, war zones, hospitals where children screamed in pain. That was where Nick felt his calling grow stronger. He remembered what it was like to feel forgotten, to sit in the dark and wonder if anyone cared. And so he began going to the places that society had abandoned. Not for the headlines, not for a viral video, but because he knew pain lived there. And where pain lived, he wanted to bring light. The first time he spoke in a prison, he wasn't sure how he would be received. The room was filled with men twice his size, most of them covered in tattoos, their faces unreadable. Some crossed their arms, skeptical. Others sat back with an air of indifference. But Nick wasn't afraid. He'd stood in front of giants before, giants of fear, giants of shame, giants of grief. He rolled to the front of the gymnasium and paused. "You think I don't know what it feels like to be trapped?" he began, his voice steady. "Maybe my prison doesn't have bars. But for years, I was locked inside a body I didn't want. A life I thought had no purpose. I wanted out. I tried to give up. And I know some of you have, too." The silence was thick. One man, near the back, looked down. Another wiped at his eyes with a sleeve. And as Nick told his story, his struggle, his surrender, his redemption, their walls began to crumble. Not all at once, but brick by emotional brick. By the end of the hour, hardened men stood in line to thank him. Some wept openly. One whispered, "No one ever spoke to me like I was worth saving, until today." That moment ignited something in Nick. He didn't just want to reach the unreachable. He wanted to remind them they had never been unreachable to begin with. In the months that followed, Nick traveled to orphanages in Eastern Europe, refugee camps in the Middle East, leper colonies in parts of Asia. Places where brokenness wasn't hidden, it was everywhere. Where the air itself seemed heavy with despair. In one refugee camp, a little boy with amputated legs sat alone, covered in dust, watching others play. Nick rolled up beside him and smiled. You know, Nick said softly, I can't run either. But I've got a racing heart. The boy looked at him, unsure. Nick wiggled the little foot he did have. Not much, huh? But enough to change the world. The boy cracked a shy smile. These weren't speeches. These were encounters. Moments that rewrote lives one sentence, one tear, one laugh at a time. Nick didn't always have the answers. But he had presence. And often, presence was enough. He met veterans haunted by things they'd seen. He sat with mothers holding children they couldn't feed. He looked into eyes dulled by trauma and reminded them of their worth. And time again, he told them, you're not forgotten. You were made on purpose. For a purpose. But not every trip was easy. Some nights, he collapsed from exhaustion. The physical toll of travel, of being lifted, carried, propped into beds in countries with no disability infrastructure, it wore him down. Infections came. His tiny foot got bruised and battered from too many transfers. His body, already fragile, sometimes rebelled against his relentless drive. But Nick pressed on. Not because he was superhuman, but because he had seen what giving up could cost. Still, he wasn't immune to fear. Once, while preparing to speak in a country torn by conflict, he received a threat. A warning that if he went through with the event, it could end badly. Friends urged him to cancel. Even local organizers suggested pulling back. But Nick thought of the faces. Of the children, the broken-hearted men, the invisible women who needed hope. He prayed. And then he went. That day, standing under the sun in a makeshift shelter surrounded by guards and tension, he delivered a message of peace. He didn't speak politics. He didn't push religion. He spoke truth. About dignity. About courage. About the choice to be more than our wounds. The crowd stood quietly, holding on to every word. No incident happened. But something else did. A shift. A moment of unity in a place so divided. Back home, Kene often worried. You're only one person, she would whisper late at night, their children asleep down the hall. Nick would nod, understanding. But he'd also smile. One is enough to start a fire. And she knew. He had to go. For every child he lifted in spirit, for every man behind bars who hugged him like a brother, for every forgotten soul who left his presence believing they mattered, Nick believed it was worth the risk, the fatigue, the ache in his bones. He wasn't running a career. He was waging a quiet revolution. He once said, I used to ask why I was born this way. Now I ask how I can use this body to serve someone else. And in the farthest corners of the earth, in the darkest of places, he lived that answer. He wasn't afraid of giants anymore. He had become one. The stadium was packed. Rows upon rows of seats filled with people from every walk of life, families, teenagers, CEOs, pastors, students, skeptics, and believers, all gathered under the glow of artificial lights that bathed the arena in an electric hum. It wasn't a concert. There was no band, no pyrotechnics, no dancers. Just a single stage and a ramp that led to a small platform in the center. A hush fell over the crowd as the lights dimmed and a single spotlight lit the ramp. Then came the soft whir of wheels. Nick Vujicic emerged from the side stage, dressed in a dark suit with his small foot gently resting on the edge of his wheelchair. His smile radiated warmth, humility, and something else, something you couldn't quite name, but could feel. The crowd erupted in applause, standing to their feet, many already with tears in their eyes. Nick rolled to the center, paused, and surveyed the scene. I used to think I had nothing to give, he said, voice firm but gentle, cutting through the noise like a blade through fog. No arms to reach out, no legs to stand on. I thought I was a mistake. But tonight, I want to show you something else. He paused as the screens behind him flashed images from his life. A black and white photo of him as a newborn in his mother's arms, a grainy video of him typing on a keyboard with his toes, a clip of him speaking to a packed high school gym, his wedding day. The faces of children from refugee camps, prison cells, hospital beds, all places he had visited, all lives he had touched. Nick's story wasn't just a story anymore. It was a ripple across the world, carried by a man with no limbs and limitless reach. He continued, people ask me what legacy I want to leave. It's not about statues. It's not about books. It's not about fame. It's about someone, somewhere, deciding that today is not the day they give up, that their pain is not pointless, that their story still matters. The audience was silent now, clinging to every word. He spoke not like a man delivering a rehearsed speech, but like someone holding a conversation with 10,000 souls all at once. He shared about his fears, his failures, the nights he still cried. He didn't pretend to have conquered everything. Instead, he reminded them that courage wasn't the absence of struggle, it was choosing to show up in the middle of it. Behind him, more footage rolled. Nick swimming in a pool, laughing as he bobbed in the water like a buoy. Nick surfing with help, catching a wave, and yelling with pure joy. Nick holding his child close, planting a kiss on their forehead using his chin. Nick standing beside world leaders, speaking in parliaments, visiting slums, comforting strangers. A lifetime of impact, not measured in trophies or money, but in moments of real change. My body doesn't define me, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Never has. Never will. My faith defines me. My purpose defines me. And I stand, yes, stand, before you today to tell you that your story isn't over. That the world needs what only you can give. The screens behind him faded to black, and in the stillness, a single phrase appeared in bold white letters. No legs. No limits. The crowd erupted. Some clapped. Some cried. Some simply stood there, stunned by what they had witnessed, not just a man defying odds, but a spirit that made odds irrelevant. Afterward, as the crowd slowly filtered out into the night, many lingered in the aisles, talking softly, hugging each other, processing what they'd just experienced. One young man stood with tears streaming down his face, holding a sign that read, "You saved me." Nick remained backstage, sitting in a quiet corner, sipping water. His team hovered nearby, but no one said much. They didn't need to. They all felt it. The weight of what had just passed wasn't just in decibels or applause. It was in the invisible shift that happens when someone changes how they see themselves. A few moments later, his son toddled in, barefoot, giggling, and climbed into Nick's lap. Nick smiled, nuzzling into the boy's hair, inhaling the simple joy of fatherhood. Kane followed, kneeling beside them, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. This, too, was part of the legacy. Not just the stages, not just the books and broadcasts, but the love they lived at home, the faith they passed on, the quiet, unseen moments that mattered just as much. Nick looked down at his son and whispered, "You can do anything, buddy. Anything." Later that night, as they drove home under a sky scattered with stars, Nick gazed out the window, lost in thought. He remembered being a boy, staring into the same night sky, asking why he had been born without limbs. Now, decades later, the question had changed. It was no longer, "Why me?" It was, "What can I still give?" Because the truth he had come to understand was this: purpose is not something you find. It's something you decide to live, every day, every moment, no matter your circumstance. And that kind of purpose doesn't require limbs. It only requires heart. And Nick had never run out of that. If this story moved you, click like. It tells us to keep sharing stories that inspire hope. And share this video with someone who might need a reminder that no life is too broken to shine. Tell us in the comments, what's one challenge you refuse to let define you? We read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe. Because here, we believe that no matter your limits, your purpose can still be limitless. No arms, no legs, no limits. And if Nick could rise, what's stopping you?